Well, welcome back, everybody, and to this kind of final session of the day today, when we're really focusing in on, I think, one of the really big issues that has been front page news this year, or indeed front page fake news, perhaps, but which is really about the role that technology plays in the emergence of misinformation and disinformation, and what impact that has on our society, on Western democracies, and also our ability as societies to make informed judgments about things. So I think we're going to have a really fascinating discussion. We've got a terrific panel for you who are going to join me just in a moment, and with a range of diverse perspectives. And now there is one panelist we're still waiting to join. So Damian Collins Mp, I think is I think he's literally just joining us. But if I can, I'm just going to quickly go around the panel and ask them to introduce themselves, tell you where they're from, and then we're going to get into what I think is going to be a very interesting conversation. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Nina Shikh, who's author and broadcaster and author of the book Deepfakes. Nina.
Hi, thank you, Anthony. Well, my background is in international geopolitics and information warfare. And for the last decade, I've been seeing through my work at the front line of global events, from the Russian invasion of Ukraine to Brexit and election interference in the US and beyond, how information warfare is changing thanks to technology. And recently, I've become very interested in the emergence of synthetic media and deepfakes.
Thank you, Nina. I'd also like to go to Anna Sophie Harling, who's from NewsGuard. Anna.
Hi, I'm Anna Sophie. I run the European side of a company called NewsGuard, which uses journalists to rate the reliability of news and information websites. And I was recently asked to join the board of Ofcom. So that's, I think, also quite relevant for this discussion when we're thinking about regulating big tech.
Thank you very much. And it's also great to have Professor Dame Wendy Hall with us, and somebody who I'm sure everybody does know in this world. But Wendy, please just give a little bit of your background.
Exciting then. So I'm at the University of Southampton. I chaired the AI Review for the UK. I'm on the AI Skills Council and just do a lot of stuff in this world these days. So, and too many of these types of panels, but it's great to be here today.
Well, it's great to have you, Wendy. And from New York, we have Andy Parsons, who's director for the Content Authentication Initiative at Adobe. Andy.
Thanks, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be here with this esteemed panel. I'm Andy Parsons. I run the Content Authenticity Initiative at Adobe, which is a broad industry partnership and consortium of companies led by Adobe to try to address the issue of content provenance and media provenance, which is in many ways the idea of proving truth instead of detecting fakery, which I think is very relevant to today's discussion. And it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Andy. And finally, Damian Collins Mp. Damian, if you'd just like to introduce yourself.
Sure, I'm Damian Collins, MP for Folkestone, formerly chair of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. I chaired the inquiry the committee did on disinformation and fake news.
Brilliant. So I think, as you can see, we've got a fantastic panel of tremendous expertise across, what is really one of the most important issues of the moment. And what we're going to do over the course of the session is to, first of all, to focus in a bit about what the problem is and how much worse it could get. Secondly, question about whether we can disentangle some of the roles of the different players. We'll then go on to talk about solutions. But then I've also challenged the panel to, when we wrap up, to come forward with one reason that they have to be positive about what we can achieve and do in this space to address some of these challenges. So I'm hoping that we'll end on an optimistic note. But I wanted to start with this issue of kind of really, I suppose, what's the problem and how much worse could it get? The original vision for the World Wide Web was that it would democratize knowledge and information, and that would be a good thing. Nina, is that still the case? And if not, what do you think went wrong?
It absolutely is no longer the reality. The kind of utopian founders of the internet obviously had a vision, and what's come to pass is that the internet has shaken the foundations of society in a profound way that we're still really trying to conceptualize and deal with. And it's become abundantly clear in the last 10 years, and I think in the next 10 years, as we see the rise of more synthetic media, and we see the half of the world's population which isn't connected to the internet yet plugging into this ecosystem, that actually what we're facing is a monumental crisis of bad information. So it was naive of the original utopian founders to think that somehow this would only be used to proliferate good information. Yes, there is a lot of good information and knowledge, but similarly, bad information is abundant too. And I think really what's going on here is that the information ecosystem itself has completely transformed in the last 30 years, not only with the birth of the internet, but also with smartphones and social media. And as I already mentioned, I'm sure we'll get into, the whole world is going to be connected to this ecosystem soon, where there are no protections. It's a very dangerous place to be. And I think we're simply still reeling with the scale of what's happening here. It's a complete paradigm change, which is transforming society and politics as we know it.
So Wendy, were the early pioneers of the internet naive? And at what point did we start to get a sense that, democratizing knowledge, democratizing information, was potentially going to have these negative effects?
So I don't know about naive, although I think retrospectively one could say that. I think the vision was amazing, and I think we should all be very grateful that they had that vision. Just imagine COVID 20 years ago when we didn't have all this. I think we've in COVID we have learned again to wonder at the thing that is the internet, and how it is up to us to safeguard it and to help it to develop in a way that's good for humanity. Even more, it's so real now. The key thing for me, and is to think of it in different layers. So I've been writing this book with Kieran O'Hara about, we call it 4 internets, so the fragmentation of the internet according to geopolitical regions that you're in. But the key thing is that internet one is still there and is an open and free, and the technology standards are still universal and ubiquitous. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't have any of this. It would be gone in terms of a global communication system. But what's happening around that is the way that different governments govern the access to data and control of what content can and can't go onto the internet, and who regulates that, and who. So the other 3 internets of the 4 we talk about is the sort of market-led force in the US and to some extent China, but the privacy and data-driven lead in Europe. And then, of course, you might say surveillance or paternalistic view in China, depending on what you think about things in terms of the control of the internet. And as I was saying before we come on, in some ways it's a safer place to be on the internet in China if you don't mind not having free speech and you don't mind the fact that the government can tell you anything. It's otherwise it can be. And I think we have to think of things from this point of view. So. You were talking in the intro about we're talking about Western democracies. There are, of course, lots of Southeastern democracies as well. Vietnam, Singapore, I don't know, Vietnam isn't it? Taiwan, South Korea, but they have different values in a sense to us. And just look at what's happened with COVID in terms of the way they've been able to control the test and trace in ways that we just couldn't. And people, You know, when they told people they had to self-isolate, that meant you self-isolate, or you know, and I think the same sorts of values apply here. And Nina, you were saying about you know, it's 50% of the world to come onto the internet. Well, that 50% is in rural China, rural India, and rural Africa. Rural Africa and rural China will be governed the way China is governed, largely on the internet. India is very interesting. It's the biggest democracy, and which way it goes on the internet will hugely, I think, swing the way the internet evolves globally. And those are the sorts of those geopolitical pressures and fault lines that are emerging. I think I could talk forever about this. I shut up now, but I think they're really important to this debate as to how do we manage misinformation, and who regulates it. And don't forget, most of the data is in the companies, not the government. So we worry about what our governments are doing with our data. Actually, of course, it's all in the big companies that where a lot of the worries, concerns are.
So Wendy, I mean, what you described there in many ways is this tension that we all live on, this spectrum between kind of freedom and control. And Damian, if I can come to you, I'd like to get your perspective as a politician about the impact that you feel that disinformation and misinformation is having on political discourse, and the extent to which it's really corroding a quality of discourse that maybe that we had in the past, that was somehow better managed, because I don't know, because the politics was different, the media was different. But I'm curious, I suppose your view of how things have changed and what that means for politics and political discourse in the UK.
Well, I think I wouldn't just limit it to the UK. I'd certainly look at other countries as well, because what we're seeing is the social media has become the principal channel for certainly younger adults for where they get news from. So more like, according to Ofcom UK, young adults are now more likely to get their news from social media than they are from television. And what's that news environment like? It's one which is dominated by the loudest voices that can flood the zone with information, because the systems were designed, the business model of companies like Facebook is designed to hold people's attention. And it is indiscriminate as to what it requires to hold people's attention, and to target people based on their interests or even psychological profiling. And you make that then the principal channel through which people get political ideas. You know, and where it's very easy for well-organized external actors to flood the information zone with things that they want them to see, to point them in the direction they want them to go, to be able to target the people who are most likely to be persuadable. We're in a world then, an information world, where the political debate happens in a world not where it is curated by editors and experts and people ensuring balance and that voices have a chance to be heard, but by an algorithm that just wants your attention. And if that is the environment we're asking people to go and get their news from and decide how they vote from, it would be impossible to think of the emergence of movements like QAnon at the speed with which they've risen, these mass conspiracy theory sites or organizations, without social media propelling it. You know, it would be impossible to think that a president could have launched a campaign against the electoral system in his own country and have people taken to the streets to say, you know, stop them stealing the vote, without social media doing it and driving that engagement. And so that is the world we're in now. I think even going back 4 years ago, when we were worried about targeted ads and you know, what the Russians were doing, that's also part of the mix. But I think things have moved on a lot now, where we see a huge number of actors pumping the information zone with information. And I think when we talk about regulating that, I think we're not just talking about regulating content and saying, well, who should decide whether this is disinformation or not. I think we're now really talking about regulating business models that allow information to be shared in this way, and question not just about what sort of content moderation should there be for people that are spreading not only harmful disinformation, but you know, disinformation that could undermine our confidence in our whole democratic system and society. So who decides on the content itself? And I think, as Nina will, I'm sure, talk about, when you have deep fakes, I mean, it can't be someone's First Amendment constitutional rights to make a fake film of somebody saying something they've never said. You know, when you can pump that into that zone, who decides? And what sort of regulation should there be of the amplification of that speech? You know, who is deciding that actually these messages should reach tens of millions of people? And I think we have that debate here now, seeing the growing importance of social media at the heart of our political discourse. But then you look at countries like the Philippines, where the entire country's on Facebook. The entire country accesses news and information effectively through this platform and works in this way. And this, I think this rate of this pace of change is accelerating. And I think we should look at the election cycle this year and say that we should be, I think, even more concerned about it now than we were 4 years ago.
So many interesting things to explore there. Anna Sophia, I want to come to you in a moment on how traditional media has changed and what that means in terms of if you no longer have this mediator who is able to to find to sort of stand up for the truth. But before we do that, I just wanted to come back to you, and maybe it's kind of point of clarification for me. Could you describe the difference between disinformation and misinformation? And then secondly, in a way, what came first? Deliberate manipulation of media or the social media algorithm, and what's the relationship between the two?
Well, essentially, both disinformation and misinformation are forms of bad information. What distinguishes them is the intent. So disinformation is bad information that is spread intentionally, whereas misinformation is simply bad information that spreads sometimes naively with no expressed intent to deceive. We are facing an abundance of both mis and disinformation, and as COVID has shown this year, both mis and disinformation can be just as harmful as one another. In terms of which came first, I would say that bad information and misinformation, disinformation, in all its guises are inherently human phenomena. So it's not that the internet has created this. This is a human phenomena that's been around for as long as human society has been around. What is different now is the ability for bad information to spread, as well as the democratization increasingly through technology in the creation of increasingly sophisticated forms of mis and disinformation. And one of those is obviously the generation of entirely fake media by AI, which is a development that's only really been around for the last 3 years. So not only has the information ecosystem changed, but the potency in terms of the actual bad information is changing too.
So I want to come back to the deepfake point in a moment, but Anna Sophie, so we've traditionally relied on the media to filter information and filter out the misinformation and the disinformation, and at least give us some kind of version of the truth that we could, it might be a strong point of view, but there were certain standards and values that underpinned that. How are things changing for traditional media in terms of suddenly they're having to deal, it seems to me, with a totally different environment?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it sort of it comes down to, as you said, a set of standards and brand recognition, right? So it used to be the case that you would walk into your local corner shop and you'd decide whether to pick up a copy of The Guardian or The Times or The Telegraph, and you'd know and recognize all of the different names and understand who was behind them and the different political leanings. And crucially, you'd also see sort of a range of headlines on the news of the day. The same thing with the TV, right? You would turn on the TV and everyone knows the major news channels and the differences between them. But on the internet, it all kind of looks the same, right? It's extremely easy for someone to sit in a basement and put up a news website that looks as though it's run by as many journalists as work for a local newspaper or the BBC. And what you have there is that the ordinary user goes onto social media and is bombarded with hundreds of news sources and no way of knowing who is behind them, what their intentions are, how they are funded, what their political leanings are, and if there is an agenda. And so it's quite difficult to expect, ordinary users to understand how to navigate that information ecosystem. And as Damian pointed out, the way that the social media platforms work is they give the most ability of amplification to sources of news that tend to incite emotional responses that are wild, that are crazy, that are unbelievable, that are much more exciting than the average news headline that it might be generated from a credible news source. And many of these bad actors are competing with traditional news outlets for advertising revenue. So what we're seeing is that traditional news outlets are seeing a decline in advertising revenue because those advertising clicks are going towards purveyors of misinformation rather than traditional media outlets. So it's quite a difficult landscape, and I think what we'll see is that traditional media will have to find ways to produce content that reaches younger audiences who might be more interested in the type of content coming out of TikTok or Snapchat or Instagram. But yeah, it's definitely a growing issue.
So we've got this kind of democratization of information. We've got this democratization of the tools to create content and create news. And we've got this sort of amplification tool, which was social media, which people have discovered, and it seems to be feeding, feeding on, which is essentially kind of a very human trait, which is to be fascinated by sensationalist news and headlines. I mean, traditional newspapers have always traded on sensationalist headlines, but then, Nina, we have this emergence of synthetic media, which your argument is takes us to a whole new level, and in particular because we've got the ability to create synthetic video and audio, which means that suddenly we can no longer trust the thing that we've always relied upon is seeing somebody say something and know that they said it. Tell us more about that.
Yes. Well, technology is obviously democratizing content creation. And when you talk about manipulated media, there has always been a long history. So Stalin, for example, was famous for developing a cottage industry for the manipulation of photographs. There was an entire cottage industry around Stalinism to tamper with the historical record. But of course, technology has always made the tampering of media easier, to the point where now we're looking at a future where artificial intelligence will be able to generate wholly synthetic media, such as film. Traditionally, manipulating film would have been something that would have been for somebody with a tremendous amount of resources, like a Hollywood studio or a state actor. But in the next 5 to 7 years, this technology is going to become more accessible, and it will be available through interfaces like smartphone apps. So anybody, as the other half of the world, which isn't connected into this information ecosystem yet, as they join in, we're also going to have this perfect storm of basically anybody being able to tamper with or create synthetic media. So your very perception of what is truth, what is reality, starts to become very shaky. One of the first consequences of this crisis of bad information, and this is something that Andy is trying to deal with at the Content Authenticity Initiative, is that if there is an abundance of fake media, or even the knowledge that this media can be faked, then even all authentic media can be decried as fake. And that's something known as a liar's dividend. So you're not only looking at a future where anybody can create increasingly sophisticated fake content, but also a future where any bad actor, or perhaps an ill-informed actor, can decry all authentic media as fake. So you're really facing a future where there is no objective standard for what can be seen as reality or truth. And that is obviously devastating for democracies, and potentially for other for other political systems. It can be used as a tool of authoritarian coercion as well.
Thanks. So Andy, so Stalin was there with his cottage industry of people manipulating images, and you can imagine he would have quite liked to have access to some of the tools that we all have on our computers today. So clearly for Adobe, this is an issue that you have understood and recognized as being really significant, and one way where you have a role to play. Take us through that process in a way, because I mean a company like yours could simply say, well, look, we just make tools. It's not up to us to determine how people use our tools, you know. But you seem to have taken a different role.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk about that. I want to just very quickly go back to one of your earlier questions about whether the founders of the internet were naive, and I'm going to take the less popular position and say I think they probably were. And the reason I say that is because they did not, or probably could not possibly have imagined the sort of imbalance of access. And I think we've talked a lot about access to media and truth, but we haven't talked much about access to audiences. And this goes back to the idea of amplification. So not only is media, whether it's conceived or created inauthentically or authentically, amplified by social media primarily, but really by the internet and what it's become, but so is the misinterpretation of that media. And by the time an end user sees something, without knowing what it is, where it came from, who made it, who published it, and kind of the steps it went through from birth to what you're seeing, it becomes absolutely impossible to believe anything. And the reason to believe something at all might be simply because it fits your worldview. And I think all the panelists have touched on the real danger is that, because if it fits your worldview, you may just go ahead and share it and further amplify it. And that goes beyond the social media platform responsibility to the very nature of what is real and what is newsworthy, because none of us have the reliance anymore, as I did when I was a kid, on 3 news networks here in the States. If I talked to a neighbor about news, we would have one of 3 perspectives on truth, not millions or billions of perspectives on truth. So Adobe's position on all this has been, number one, these tools are going to exist whether we create them or not. Arguably, Adobe is in the best position to create really sophisticated, powerful tools, the nature of which Nina described, that have been traditionally the realm of Hollywood studios and multi-million-dollar film budgets. These things are available now. I don't think we're talking about the next 2 or 3 years. If you look at some of the things that our company unveiled at the Adobe Max conference this year, these are extremely powerful in most cases now. Even I would say, many more cases than last year's Adobe Max. These are powerful AI tools. They use AI in the cloud. They analyze what a user is doing. They can even predict what the user wishes to do next and how best to do that thing. And those are tools that should not be precluded or prevented from being invented. They should be encouraged. So our perspective is not only that these tools can be used in inauthentic ways, but that they can be used to create amazing creative works in photography, video, etc. And that powering AI, powering artists and creative professionals with AI can help them do more interesting work more quickly and more efficiently. And therefore, they should be empowered to use these tools responsibly. So our answer to how to combat inauthentic media through provenance, which is the cryptographic association of data about origin with media itself, is the same answer we give to creative pros who want to use these tools responsibly. If you want to use them responsibly and be transparent about how things were created, you turn on something like content authenticity, and as we say, show your work.
Great. Look, I'd like to explore a little bit further in a minute in terms of the how that responsibility is shared more widely across the tech ecosystem. But I also want to get into a bigger point of trying to, in a way, disentangle the roles of technology companies, social media companies, traditional media, but also politicians themselves. I mean, Damian, obviously, you've done a lot of work focusing on some of the specific problems you see with social media companies. But in a world when the Washington Post, I think, has worked out that in his time as president, Donald Trump made false or misleading claims 22,000 times in the course of his presidency. In a world where you have political leaders who seem to have so little concern for the truth, or feel so that they don't feel constrained by the truth, how then is the rest of the information ecosystem supposed to work? Because because it's very hard for traditional media outlets not to simply repeat those misleading claims, because they're simply saying, they're reporting what a political leader has said. And it's also difficult for, as we know, for social media companies in any way to censure what political leaders are saying, because they potentially face kind of real significant penalties for doing so. So how do we get back to a situation where politics itself, it seems to put where we restore the value of truth, I suppose, to politics and political discourse? Oh, sorry, you're on mute, David. Sorry.
It's the kind of quote of the year, isn't it? It's the phrase of the year.
Yes.
So on election night and in the days afterwards in America, what you saw was the networks stopping broadcasting his press conferences because they were not going to dignify this nonsense by broadcasting it to our viewers. The newspaper editors can decide not to report what a politician has said, or to report it in saying this is a complete load of nonsense and here are the reasons why you should not believe what this person is saying. But social media bypasses those filters that would have been there in the past. It doesn't matter that the networks stop broadcasting it, because Trump can film what he's saying himself, and he can broadcast it himself through social media to everyone he wants to see it. Actually, it's the people that he really wants to see it, that he's really trying to motivate with that, and there is no filter for that. So it's in the same way in the 1930s, the Nazis recognized the power of radio. You could unfiltered bypass all the establishment, bypass all the newspaper editors, and you could speak directly to someone in their own home. And so in the past, we've recognized the power these new media have to connect political voices and leaders with people. And on the whole, we've sought to create codes and rules and regulations around that to make sure that power has not been abused. But even the creation of the Federal Communications Commission in America in the 1930s was designed to stop the sort of monopolization of media, undue foreign ownership, to make sure voices had equal access to it as a new media. What we're seeing now in politics is that if a politician lies or a president lies, rather than being called out, it can be amplified to millions and millions of people through social media channels without very much intervention. I think it was good that social media companies started to call some of this out. I think it was good that Twitter started to flag the president's tweets being disputed. Was that effective, or did it make more people look at them? I don't know. I mean, I certainly, when I saw some of them, thought your first instinct say, what on earth he said this time, and to go and see. But at least there was an attempt at an intervention. And I think that's that is what we've got to consider now, is what method of intervention is, because certainly the social media the companies themselves don't believe that sort of First Amendment rights mean they can't intervene in speech in any way, because they are making interventions on speech. They are making decisions on speech. And I think if you consider the question of what the regulatory environment is, either around elections or media, is to say, should it ultimately be just down to the companies to make these decisions about when they take down a deepfake film, when they flag a piece of content? But the issue is that if anything, the system encourages people like Trump to lie, because because you're lying, it doesn't mean your message won't get heard. So
can I push you a little bit though, because not every politician is Trump, right? And there are lots of other politicians who seem to be on the margins of some of this, and sometimes not quite sure. Do I repeat and support a statement that is sort of clearly untrue, or do I stand up and say, well, hang on a minute, that isn't quite right? Do our politicians, I suppose I'm trying to say, have a role to play in trying to re-establish truth as a fundamental value?
But of course, I mean, politics. Of course, we want high standards from our leaders, and we want our leaders that we can look up to and believe in. But if we've got a media ecosystem which actually encourages politicians to be extreme, to be more and more extreme in what they say, because every time they do, there's this massive flash mob of people there virtually clapping and cheering them on, and creating an audience around more. That's why we've got this ecosystem now of extreme politicians, people, supposedly journalists interviewing extremists and people holding extreme opinions, because they're building up quite a big following doing so, where someone, interviewing moderate people, giving moderate, well thought through opinions, would not be as interesting. So I think it's an interesting question, is to say, when we look at politics today, is the politics today being driven by the politicians? Well, to an extent, because they're the ones putting themselves forward. But actually, is this more extreme form of politics been made possible by the way social media works, where the sort of people that are benefiting from that are the sort of people that wouldn't have been taken seriously in the past and wouldn't have been given these platforms to speak out?
Yeah, if I can jump in on that, I agree completely. I also think that there's a newish phenomenon arising, which is, it's one thing for a leader, a Donald Trump, to stand up in front of a camera and lie, even if he's broadcasting the footage himself, not via a CNN or a MSNBC or a Fox News. But there's also the blowback in the reverse, right? There is a feedback loop here, where if a leader gets up and tells lies, a follower of that leader or someone with even more malicious intent, perhaps a foreign state actor, could take something like the seminal Nancy Pelosi video that was a huge kind of harbinger of things to come here in the States in 2019. And that was a cheap fake. This was a video of the Speaker of the House of Congress here in the US that was slowed down. For all we know, Adobe tools may have been used, but frankly, any trivial video manipulation tool could have been used. No artificial intelligence or machine learning whatsoever. And that goes into a feedback loop where Trump and Trump followers and others could further share that as evidence that what has been said is true via manipulated fake that someone else has made. So this notion of complete anonymity and no audit trail of where something came from, what it is, and how it was made is to us kind of the root of the problem of this sort of amplification, because part of something may have been said, part of something else may be manipulated, and this sort of ends in a true, like fully synthetic manipulated piece of media that underscores a message that was untrue to begin with. And I think that's really a huge part of the danger that we face.
Mm. Wendy, are there so I mean, you know, when we look at the way that the web fundamentally works, and you know, are there you know, are there any sort of deep technical solutions to this? Is there anything that can be done at a sort of architectural level, or have we really got to deal with the hard stuff on the sort of surface of this?
Well, in terms of recognizing a deep fake, I suppose I think my answer is no, not because I think it's a bit like any security. You're always chasing the people that are faster and cleverer than you at breaking whatever or developing new things. I mean, you know, the best cybersecurity people are the people that have tried to break it in the first place. And things about deep fakes and that's, you know, the technology is getting so good, and trying to develop AI solutions to identifying that some things are fake is probably a hiding to nothing. I in terms of just straight technology, right? Of course you can apply technologies. I think there's also the issue, you've got this whole issue of openness versus identity, really. It's you know, if we all had to declare, if we had to identify ourselves before we did anything on the internet in a way that was regulated, you could stop a lot of this. But are we prepared to do that? You know, it's always a trade-off, right? And I think in some it comes back. I was listening to Andy talking about Trump, and you know, in some ways it comes back to moral values and social responsibility as much as it does the technical trying to pursue technical solutions or reform the internet so it's more secure until quantum comes. I mean, when quantum comes, right, all bets are off, right? Andy's nodding. All bets are off, right? Anything we think is safe on the internet just won't be. So there are major issues to come, and so I think when I was on the Internet Governance Commission, we kept talking about the stakeholders. It is governments, it is big industry, but it's also us as individuals and people, and individuals and collectives. And there are always trade-offs, and it's somehow as society we've got to work out how we balance those trade-offs, how we self-regulate, or how, like, the media and companies self-regulate, and what our moral responsibilities are. You know, I mean, people seem to be, and this comes back to what Trump does, people seem to be free to do what they want on the internet, what they wouldn't do in a real world situation. And I don't know how you get around that. In the past, people became civilized through religion. I'm not sure we want to go back to that one, but you know, right, that's how civilizations became more civil, was through religious and moral codes. And what's the 21st equivalent of that, you know?
That's a very interesting question. So let's try and get into this a little bit, because I mean, I was kind of thinking about whether can we either regulate or educate our way out of this. Damian, I mean, you're a very strong advocate for a duty of care, and can you explain a little bit about kind of what you think that means, and crucially, how do you prevent a situation where what you're really saying is that you want these companies to become the arbiters of the truth, and how do you balance that? And you're on mute again, so if I
the duty of care is the principle that we expect will underpin the online harms bill, which is to say that the companies have got an obligation to their users, and one of those obligations will be to protect them from harmful content. Some of that content is illegal, like child abuse or content that incites people to commit terrorist attacks or commit crimes. Some of that content will be in that category of stuff that is harmful but not illegal. Now, cyberbullying could be, I think, a good example of that. But I think within that is has to be a sense of responsibility. We can see if someone is making baseless claims about events that haven't happened, targeting individuals in an aggressive way based on things they've never done or said, introducing films and information that have clearly been inauthentic and have been fabricated, spreading medical conspiracy theories during a public health emergency like the coronavirus and building up to the release now of the COVID vaccine. And indeed, the tech companies themselves have already started to make calls on this about trying to restrict the spread of coronavirus disinformation, anti-vaccine disinformation, removing QAnon from Facebook. So even the companies themselves can see that this is not just about free speech, it's about actually dangerous, baseless conspiracy theories that can cause harm. I think when we look to regulate, so is it reasonable to say the companies should be able to detect anything anyone posts anywhere in the world in real time? That's probably quite a tall order, although of course there is tech that is being used at the moment to try and help identify disinformation sources and networks of disinformation. What I think under the duty of care the company should be effective at is preventing the amplification of harmful content, and then there I think because their systems are designed to spot that. That's how they make money. It's been designed to gather data, spot trends, understand what people are interested in, so you can target them with information. So within that system, you could say, if you can see harmful content is trending or being promoted, or there are large networks of groups and accounts and pages that are pushing that through your systems, that's where we might expect you to intervene and come in. To look at your own ad tools as well and say, do the ad tools help with this process? So should there be more responsibility over how they're used in different categories? So, for example, YouTube do not allow the use of the customer match ad tool for political campaigning, where Facebook do allow lookalike audiences to be used for that. So should there be rules around that, recognizing that the way you sell an ideology is not the same as the way you sell a pair of shoes, or shouldn't be? So, and therefore these are tools of responsibility you're looking to build in. Other industries have this. So the financial services around the world are required to consider things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and if you're an American company, or the Bribery Act, or if you're a UK company, to be on the lookout for fraudulent activity, to identify it and call it out and report it. And that if you're bad at doing these things, and these are judgment calls, then there are quite hefty sanctions imposed on you. Broadcasting in the UK operates under a broadcasting code where the regulator makes subjective judgments all the time about how well the companies comply with the code they're expected to keep to. So I think when we think about a regulatory regime, we're thinking about setting out clear responsibilities we think people have got, and saying that the companies are no longer simply neutral platforms. When they're amplifying and boosting content to their users in order to hold their engagement, then they are curating that content. And you can look at the case of was cited in the internal Facebook report from 2016, looking at Facebook in Germany, where they discovered that 60% of people that joined groups on Facebook that shared extremist content did so at Facebook's recommendation. And so that you can say, well, those sort of things could be quite clear examples of where the company has failed in its duty of care.
So I get that you're trying to break that link between the content and the amplification of the content. How though do you deal with the issue of either the individual user who may just be a member of the public, or indeed a highly prominent political person, who then says, "Well, hang on a minute, my views, my point of view is being censored," and so how do you address that issue? Because that's going to happen, right? Because we're in a world today where people feel that they can say anything and express themselves in any way they want on social media. So how do we come back to the point where you're saying that, I suppose, trying to establish some fundamental values about what people should or shouldn't be saying?
So, well, yes, absolutely, because that's always existed. It exists anywhere, exists in America, it must exist in the UK, that there's always been a tension between the freedom of speech rights people have and the harm that speech can cause other people. And if someone is speaking in a way that could cause direct harm, and indeed the companies already regulate speech to an extent using those judgment tools. I have a right to speak. I don't have a right. If the BBC didn't report what I said, I can't say you're censoring my speech. I've got a right to be broadcast to the nation every time I open my mouth. But if an actor can use social media to effectively create that, to say it's not just that I'm making these comments, but actually I've got a network of tools that I can use that make sure what I say reaches a very large audience of people I want to see it. And as many people have said in this debate, that freedom of reach is not the same as freedom of speech. And I think when you consider the harm that disinformation could cause people, I think the size of the audience should be part of the equation as well. So you're thinking that the bigger the audience that is being reached, the more likely that is to spread and cause harm. And whether that is speech that incites violent acts, or whether that is speech which persuades someone not to take a perfectly safe vaccine based on a totally baseless series of lies and conspiracy theories. I think this is where we want to see a degree of responsibility come in.
Okay, and Sophie, if I can bring you in here, kind of curious in terms of your thoughts on I suppose the balance between kind of regulation and how we build more opportunities for people to access kind of verified information and good information.
Right. So I think NewsGuard definitely takes a media literacy approach. So the idea being that we empower users with information about the sources that they see in the newsfeed, but also provide them with sort of a structured way of thinking critically about the sources themselves. So even if they don't have the NewsGuard browser extension downloaded, then whenever they come across a website or a piece of content online, they're really thinking hard, do I know who's behind this website? Is it a journalist? Is it a medical professional? Do they have some sort of financial motive for telling me this information? Are they gathering and presenting news and information responsibly? So those are the sorts of things that we look at, and we do have a browser extension, and the idea behind sort of the ethos behind NewsGuard really is, we don't tell people what to read and what not to read, but should they want information about the sources that they're encountering, we're happy to give it to them. I think on the Facebook and the regulation side, I mean, one of the things I do every day is to go onto my fake accounts on social media and see what the different groups and accounts and pages are up to. And it is still happening, today, that I go onto the unofficial David Icke Facebook page, which has tens of thousands of followers. And when I hit follow, Facebook suggests 5 anti-vax groups to me and, says, here are 5 anti-lockdown and COVID is a hoax groups. And this, this is literally happening like yesterday, today. And so at that point, you really think, it's one thing to say freedom of speech should be allowed to publish whatever you want. But from a regulatory point of view, you have to think, just to bring it back to AI, every day, Facebook's algorithms make decisions about what to show people based on, their own ratings of content. And the question is, who's making those decisions about what is credible, what isn't, what should be seen. And so I think from a regulatory point of view, transparency really is the key. So there's a kind of duty for the social media platforms to be transparent about how their algorithms work, how they're making decisions about certain types of content, who's making those decisions, do they even know why their AI is making the decisions that it's making, and then transparency towards the user as well. So, if you think about protecting someone who's either, a young person or an older person and is trying to navigate the social media landscape, providing information about, who are the actors that they're encountering online, if they do come across a certain type of information, how can they report it? How can they find out more about that? There must be a way for all the different stakeholders to come together and create the type of internet that really is more in line with what it was intended to do, and doesn't have the kind of perverse incentivization for actors who think they can, make money by taking advantage of certain algorithms that are out there, and that for all we know are sort of black box, and really just hurt the end user, and I guess help drive profit towards bad actors.
Thank you. So Nina, can I come back to you on you spent a long time kind of thinking about the issue of deepfakes. Have you started to sort of formulate a way through this in terms of what we need to do collectively to get to a point where we get back to a world of good information? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Deepfakes are interesting because they are the perfect kind of microcosm of what's happening at a larger scale. They obviously didn't evolve in a vacuum. So when you talk about tackling deepfakes, the same kind of strategies actually can be implemented when it comes to maintaining the integrity of the entire information ecosystem itself. And I'd love to say that there is a silver bullet solution, and if we do this, then we won't have to contend with disinformation anymore. But that's simply not going to be the case. It is a society-wide problem. It sits above everything. So I think the first step is just conceptualizing the scale of the problem and the challenge itself, which is this information ecosystem, this kind of terra incognita, which is going to be the future of human exploration, and the fact that there aren't rules in this virtual space, the fact that this space has geopolitics, which Wendy already discussed, which are increasingly going to become fascinating and important. But when it comes to trying to have a safer information ecosystem, I think broadly you can think about solutions in two categories. The first are the technical solutions like media provenance, which of course the Content Authenticity Initiative is really leading the way on. You also will have to have things like detection capabilities for inauthentic content powered by AI, which is, as Wendy already correctly pointed out, always going to be a cat and mouse game. Nonetheless, when you look down the line and you understand the scale of inauthentic content that potentially faces us as AI becomes better at generating it, you're going to have AI tools to detect it. But then the second set of solutions that are not technical, and this is really the more fundamental kind of human solutions, are the conversations we need to have now about what does good regulation look like? What does policy look like? What does digital literacy look like? Because fundamentally what we're facing here is a paradigm change. So there is no one silver bullet. We as an entire society have to rethink, what does it mean to live in this new, radically transformed information ecosystem?
Do you think we can come to a point where we can define what good information is?
No.
No. And this is why this is so difficult.
Yeah.
Because it's very easy to be able to label, synthetic content, for example, that's been generated by artificial intelligence, and there's a big argument to say, okay, this is now where we set the standards on how, for example, synthetic media should be labeled. But of course, there are so many shades of gray, because how is, if a piece of synthetic content is used by a state actor as a piece of disinformation to undermine an election, it's quite clear cut that that is a bad piece of information. But what about a piece of synthetic content that's used by a comedian? What about a piece of synthetic content that's generated by a creative? And there is never going to be a clear-cut answer on what is good information, what is bad information, which is why the regulatory approach can also be quite dangerous. Very telling, for example, that China is one of the first countries in the world to have introduced a law outlawing deepfakes, essentially giving the state the power to say what is real and what is fake. So this is forevermore going to be a question that is not clear cut, where there's lots of gray zones.
So
but at least we can catch the low hanging fruit.
If I may just jump in there, I think the gray area is maybe even worse than Nino's portraying. If you think about things like computational photography, which now exists on pretty much every smartphone going back the last couple of years, which means effectively ubiquitous. This is the idea that the photons coming into the smartphone camera lens are not at all what ends up in the sensor. So forget about tools like Photoshop and Adobe Lightroom and things that are used by professionals to edit and manipulate for good or for bad. A powerful, equally or more powerful tool for editing and manipulating images is right there on your phone. And it's not an app you have to install. It's right there on the camera roll. So with HDR photography, where we snap 100 frames, whereas a few years ago we would snap 5, the user can post hoc decide on the exposure, what the sky looks like. A tool like Sky Replace that Adobe has created with AI will relight the foreground to match the background sky color. These things are ubiquitous, accessible, and it's very hard to talk about the underlying veracity of what is depicted in an image or a video. And this doesn't even touch miscontextualization of existing imagery and video with text that surrounds it. So again, to make a quick plug for CAI, this is why we believe in transparency. We published some research at Adobe just this week, actually focused on the UK, that showed that 74% of consumers are extremely concerned that they and their peers make bad or misinformed decisions based on the visual media they see. So there's a wide held assumption across industry that consumers will just ingest and believe what they see if you give it to them, if you're Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. And this research says that's not the case. There is a hunger and an appetite for tools of transparency. And if put in the hands of consumers, for just a note of optimism, we really believe that they will use them. And that's what we're trying to create.
So thanks, Andy. You kind of got to my last point, which was kind of notes for optimism, because I mean it very much feels like we've lifted the lid on what is a hugely complex and difficult and incredibly important problem that is worthy of much more discussion and debate. But if I could come back to everybody else. For those who are watching who are feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the implications of what you've been saying, what's one thing that makes you feel kind of more optimistic, or one thing that you feel that can and should happen in the year ahead that you think would be a positive step forward to getting back to a place where I think we could all feel a lot more comfortable? Damian, do you want to come in?
Sure. Well, I'm hopeful because I think we're starting to understand the problems and talk about them in a way that we simply weren't doing before. I think that makes it more likely we'll make better decisions. I think we're moving to a world where we recognise that we need the companies' support. We need the companies to act more responsibly, to take more responsibility for the decisions that they themselves make about the content that is curated, that they curate on their site, what they choose to promote, what they choose not to, and how they engage with their users. And I think user education is part of that. But I think you take the analogy of the motor industry. If you believe that seatbelts are a good thing to have in a car, that doesn't make you anti-car. It just thinks, you think actually we should have seatbelts. It's safer for everyone. But at the same time as making car companies put seatbelts in, at the same time you have to educate drivers as to why it's important that they wear them. So, and I think when you look at how things have evolved in other industries in the past, I think there's always that combination between saying, actually, what's the responsible thing to do based on what we now know about how this technology works, and at the same time educating users to make sure they use the tools that have been created for them to help keep them safe.
So seatbelts for our information ecosystem. Wendy.
So I thought that was great from Damian. I was going to pick up on the car analogy actually and say that car manufacturers make cars that can drive at X hundred miles an hour, but that kills people. So we have to regulate and say you can't go over 70 unless you're in Germany. So, this is like Andy saying, I'm going to give you all these great tools that are going to be dangerous for you to use, but let's be careful with them. And but that's not my. There's a really great debate going on here, and I wish we could get this going more. But my positive thing is that the internet withstood COVID, right? Basically, when we all went onto the internet and started doing our TikTok dances and our Zoom meetings and our teaching online and everything else, right? The internet is still standing. So they may have been naive, but boy, did they build a brilliant system. And that is my positive note. We still have the internet.
Yeah, and it's enabling us to have some very interesting and thoughtful conversations. Anna Sophie.
I am going to continue with the car metaphor as well. And I guess I would say that this is, I guess 2020 was the year that we learned that cars are actually dangerous. I think that what COVID has done and the very real world harm of 5G towers being burnt down is that fake news has really gone from being something that was sort of funny and quite like the butt of many jokes to, you know, really being a very real world dangerous harm. That's, you know, while that's a horrible thing, what it has done is it has also encouraged, you know, people around in many industries and governments and also the big tech platforms to sort of take some pretty big and significant first steps towards trying to solve the problems of misinformation, disinformation. And, you know, while it took something bad to get there, it's almost kind of like when it comes to, you know, regulating some of the messaging around smoking, right? Like we finally sort of agree that this is a bad thing and it's also worth spending a good deal of time on and making sure that you involve many different experts and people in, you know, the safety and tech industry of all different ages and backgrounds and levels of expertise to engage and sort of come together to try to figure out what is, you know, only going to be a bigger and bigger problem. But at least, you know, end users are now aware that they should be pretty careful when they're online.
Yeah, I think that's a big difference this year. Thank you. And finally, Nina, reasons to be cheerful.
Well, I think that, echoing the other panelists, I'm cheerful because the kind of conceptualization of the problem as being one of the entire information ecosystem is becoming abundantly clearer, and it's much easier to look at solving a problem when you can actually identify what the challenge is. And then the second point I'd make is that it seems, and I'm very encouraged and heartened by, you know, including all of the panelists here today, that the heavy lifting has begun. And of course, it isn't just one strata of society. It's not only politicians, it's not only regulators, academics, or industries. Everyone has a role to play, and the good people on this panel are doing just that. So that's been very encouraging to see how quickly these kind of networked alliances are starting to build up from the ground.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you. I can't think of a better panel to try and kind of talk through these issues with. And I think I absolutely agree with all of you. You know, I think the key thing is conceptualizing and understanding the issue, and then recognizing that it's going to take a real joint effort of a lot of people with different roles and responsibilities, understanding that they've got a role to play here, and engaging on trying to come forward with some solutions. I think you've done a fantastic job of explaining some of the issues, your views on some of the way forward, and it's been a real pleasure. And so thank you very much. And I'm sure it'll be much appreciated by our audience. So thank you very much.